All right. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Francie Collins to do some introductions.
There. Hello. We are really excited to present this workshop today because I think we've all just been through an event and we have all experienced things that that we were always aware of, but you know, an increasing amount of need and a decreasing amount of resources and some gaps in service. So we just thought this would be a good opportunity to shine light on some of the things that we found, and also to invite everybody to share their experiences. And there will be a time at the end for questions from everybody, and also to share, you know, to add your input so we could see what would our next steps be. Our goal is to, as always, facilitate collaboration and you know, I think, you know, put together a picture of where the gaps are as climate change creeps up on us, and we see that just doing more of the same thing isn't going to be sufficient. So we're going to have to change our game, I think, because we're not in a lot of separate disasters that have a beginning and an end so clear. We're in really one big rolling event, and there's not a lot. There's going to be less and less downtime. So we have some great speakers today with expertise in working with various vulnerable populations. And I think the first one up is going to be Melina Jovanovic, who is a senior analyst with the Santa Clara County Office of Immigrant Relations. And she's going to speak to us about some of the difficulties that immigrants might have in accessing resources. Melina?
All right. So let me stop sharing so that I can share Melina's presentation.
Well, while you're looking for it, I'll just do a plug for the resource list that we prepared for this. That's going to be posted on the Cadre website. We just took an assortment of resources for the various populations we're going to be talking about, and some articles about climate change and the future of disaster response. So I hope that after the workshop, you'll all go to the website, even if you don't want to see the recording of this presentation because you were there. The resource list and other things will be posted there, and we will be adding to it. So we welcome your input on this also.
Thanks. I'm still tap dancing here because I have too many screens open.
It does happen. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, we'll start in a minute.
Yeah, I apologize. It's there it is. There it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon again. My name is Melina, and I work with the Office of Immigrant Relations in Santa Clara County, and we are in the Division of Equity and Social Justice. So every time when there are disasters, we do think about the multiple obstacles that many populations face, and I definitely would like to, I don't know what that sound is really, to remind all of us that immigrants are really not such a small fraction of the population in our county. On the contrary, I first wanted to start with some concerns and some questions, and to point out to some structural issues that are affecting all members of our society, including immigrants, and also some frequently asked questions, by immigrants that are really relevant in situations of disaster, and also remind us about how our immigrant population looks like in the county. And then finish with some of your questions, perhaps, in terms of how we could continue to improve our services in general and for the immigrant population as well. So as many of you already know, the main issues in general could be tied with language access and communication, and this is crucial during the times of disaster. While I saw that Alert SEC now gives an opportunity to all of us to sign up in different languages, the question remains, do alerts later on come in the appropriate language, or are people only signing up in a different language and then all alerts come in English, come back once they're activated? As many of you also know, it is important to keep in mind that culturally appropriate outreach is needed before, during, and after emergencies. It's not just about sending information and placing some documents on websites, or sending information via social media. In many instances, it is really essential to even knock on doors or really do in-person outreach, and to do it in a culturally sensitive way. In terms of all stages of disaster, this kind of outreach and communication is essential, and this may be especially important to think about during evacuation and sheltering, and contact with first responders and government workers in general, because of negative experiences that many immigrants have had, and the dominant public discourse that is definitely not favorable when it comes to immigrants. I also would like to emphasize that intersectional approach is needed. Immigrants are also people who have gender identity, sexual orientation, they have a class status, race and ethnic identity, nationality, they belong to specific age groups, they might have a disability or disabling conditions. So all of that is not always taken into account, and we continue to look at our populations as if they only have one type of identity, and whether that's individual or group identity. So another consideration that's important is confusing coordination efforts between county, city, and community outreach efforts. I do remember the flooding of 2017, and in many instances, many immigrant communities only experienced outreach by community-based organizations, and they really felt completely disconnected from other types of information that was sent by other entities, and it shouldn't be the recipient's responsibility to think about how this coordination works and who is responsible for what. And also some other important questions that I believe we need to think about, whether we are thinking about obstacles that immigrants experience in terms of their access to information and other services that are crucial during the during any kind of disaster, is that there are some class divisions that make some communities disadvantaged in many ways if they live in neighborhoods with an infrastructure and resources that are run down and really not favorable. And in many instances in this society, including disaster situations, we rely on family resources and on community-based organizations to actually do some work, and especially when it comes to preparation for disasters. But in general, this is really something that is a question about collective efforts and also coordination of those efforts. So there are some systemic issues that, for example, what I could observe in our county relate to how we work. There are many outreach specialist positions in our county, but are we really working together and coordinating our efforts when we are informing our communities about important issues that are related to disasters? For example, just to take an example of our office and the Office of Emergency Management, are we really doing this kind of needed work so that there is coordination, especially when it's urgent? I also wanted to emphasize that what we learn is that the translation of voting materials is actually required in our county to translate voting materials in 12 languages, and I haven't seen that that's the case for actually emergency situations, and the question would be why. We observed that during the pandemic, for example, we saw a lot of materials translated in 5 languages. But our county is very complex, and our immigrant population is large. A solid majority of 54% of the county population speaks a language other than English at home, and these are over 100 major languages. So it is really a good question to think about. Why not at least 12 languages like the voting materials? And I already mentioned the separation of vulnerable populations and how we look at everyone in compartments. Other important questions that we tried to answer when we worked with the Office of Emergency Management and some other community-based organizations are the questions that immigrants frequently ask. And I think this is really important to for us to address them. Even though it is true that disaster services are exempt from public charge and have always been exempt from public charge, there are other other important things to consider. Many immigrants ask if anyone can guarantee that they won't be approached or questioned by any officials about their immigration status in and around emergency shelters. And that actually is something that I think all of us need to think about, whether anyone can guarantee that, even though based on ICE on immigration and customs enforcement on guidelines, these should be exempt or considered safe places for immigrants. I don't think that anyone can really guarantee that ICE officers wouldn't ever be around any emergency shelters. And we already had examples in the past of them being near those. So that many immigrants had to, I think during the fires in the Napa region, many actually had to hide on beaches and parks as opposed to going to emergency shelters. So another important question that I think, especially after the flooding in 2017, that we posed is how much can we rely on the availability and skills of unpaid local community members to interpret important emergency messages and disaster recovery information. And I do remember that Sacred Heart Community Services employees and Catholic Charities and many other, and Vivo at that time, and some other community-based organizations played a crucial role in working with communities during the flooding and after the flooding in the recovery stage. And many are not really paid to, or these are, some of these agencies are actually not experts in disasters or emergency services. So some other questions that we tried answering when we actually published an emergency guide for immigrants are those that Kadri also posed when you created actually the handout that I hope it will be available soon for immigrants. Is all emergency aid safe to use for immigrants? And what is available regarding of immigration status. Not knowing this is really an obstacle for immigrants, and so many are very hesitant to use any kind of aid. When we worked with the Office of Emergency Management, and some other community-based organizations like Catholic Charities to create an emergency guide for immigrants, we faced even ourselves some questions about whose responsibility is to provide this information to our immigrant population, and language appropriate translations. And whose responsibility is to do this kind of immigrant-friendly outreach. Of course, I mean, we can always say it's everyone's responsibility, but I think it would really be much more useful to really have some kind of protocols or some kind of division of labor, so that we really know who is responsible for serving our immigrant community when it comes to disasters. And in the manner that is really not creating additional obstacles. For example, we do have that guide, but it really needs to be somewhat updated, and we only have the guide in 5 languages. Some additional concerns that we definitely need to think about is how can immigrants really trust, especially government organizations when they're consistently stigmatized and in some cases even terrorized. And that's really not, it wouldn't be fair to say that this only happened during the Trump administration. There is a long history, and we can't even say that currently we have really public discourse that really is positive when it comes to immigrants. And how to remain confident in that if they even receive any kind of help from the government, that this would really resolve their problems. When we heard that after the flooding of 2017, many immigrant households, and that might be true for any households, but especially when you're facing so many barriers, and immigrants have many sources of discrimination and oppression, that it takes years to really rebuild your life after disasters. I also wanted to just point out a few major facts about immigrants in our county. So all of the previous concerns and questions are important, and especially important because of the basic facts about our immigrant population. In the county and in the city of San Jose, immigrants constitute about 40% of the total population. And as we mentioned, the solid majority speaks another language at home. The population in the city of Sunnyvale is 48 immigrant, very close to half. It's absolutely incredible. And the majority of Sunnyvale's immigrants are recent immigrants who have been 10 years or less in the United States. We also need to keep in mind that over 60% of all children in Santa Clara County have at least one immigrant parent. And this means that whatever is really out there in terms of requirements, in terms of policies and laws, in terms of access or lack of access, is affecting the majority of our county. Because when we add children who live in immigrant families, the majority of our population is in that category. Close to 137,000 undocumented residents live in Santa Clara County, and close to 158,000 of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents live with undocumented family members. So these are really great numbers. As we know, undocumented residents have even more reasons to be concerned and hesitant to use any kind of structures that are in the dominant society because of how the laws and policies are structured in our society that affect immigrants. Only a few more basic facts about the language diversity. In Santa Clara County, there is the largest population of Hindi speakers in the United States, second largest population of Vietnamese speakers, third largest population of Farsi speakers, and fifth largest population of Chinese speakers. And, again, I would argue that especially when it comes to the disaster information and even services, whether they're before or during or after the disasters, we should include at least 10, top 10 languages, and these are Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Korean, Russian, Farsi, Hindi, Japanese, and Punjabi in this order. I will end with these basic facts about our immigrant population and their access, with a few remarks about linguistically isolated communities. So we are talking about immigrants who are either monolingual or not completely fluent in English, so they're isolated, and because they primarily communicate in their native languages. And on this graph that is provided by California Immigrant Data Portal, you can see that contrary to maybe some dominant thinking or even dominant stereotypes, it is not only Latino or Mexican immigrants who are isolated on a greater scale. If you look at this graph more carefully, we can see that actually some groups of Asian immigrants have a higher rate of isolation. If we really look at specific groups as aggregates, you can see that actually, Asian Americans and Latino immigrants have a very similar rate of linguistic isolation, that as a group, Russian immigrants have even higher than those who are in these aggregate categories. You can also see that the Vietnamese immigrants have the highest rate of isolation of all. So this is really something that we need to think about, when we make decisions, how to provide materials. I wanted to end this with some remarks about resources and questions for distribution, because we are here with Kadre. I think Kadre has created an excellent handout for immigrants that's very succinct. It actually kind of summarizes what's describe that land in the disaster guide that we put together a few years ago. And to also pose a question, how we can maybe invest some efforts and all of us collaborate to provide a few updates to that resource guide as well, so that we use them together or for specific purposes. The cadre handout is more efficient to use in certain situations and for those who actually need just basic information. But in the disaster guide, the question and answer format gives many answers to some frequently asked questions by immigrants, and how we can all strategize if actually information and services to our immigrant population, that's not a small population again, is everyone's responsibility. How can we actually strategize to distribute some information, and how we can maybe think about all of our residents and groups as complex with multiple identities, and how can we really work together with the Office of Emergency Management on this, and whether there are spaces where specific community-based organizations, even if they don't focus on disaster services, can be used, and how the county, the city, and other entities, or meaning of all cities in the county and other entities that actually work in the disaster services could maybe contract or subcontract with specific agencies that actually have an expertise in working with specific communities. So with that, Francie will distribute more resources at the end. And I encourage everyone to look at all resources, not just for specific so-called vulnerable populations. And I would like to actually invite everyone to have a little bit of discussion about all of this, and maybe some questions that you all experienced when you worked on specific disasters, or maybe this current or very recent storm that we experienced. If you already had some situations that maybe are very relevant to explain some additional obstacles that maybe I didn't talk about.
Yeah, Melina, I think at the end, we were going to have everybody do the brainstorming and ask questions of all of you, because
Okay.
cross-sectionality, and the questions that are for one person may be for everybody.
That's true. So at the end, we'll all have a discussion.
Yeah, and I want to remind everybody that all of the slideshows and the handouts that we prepared will be on the Cadre website later for you to look at and have input for if you like. And next we have Gabrielle Antolovich, who is the president of the board of the Village of Frank LGBTQ Community Center in Santa Clara County, and she's going to share some of the possible obstacles to resources for this community. Gabrielle?
Hi, everyone. As someone who has worked in the community, I realize I have access to, so many resources. And then when I started asking around, so many of our LGBTQ plus communities, especially since the last president, there's been more hate, more negativity toward all minorities. We know Black Lives Matter was a response to the African American community, the Asian hate, and we were there when all of that was going on, speaking out, because the LGBTQ community actually encompasses all minorities. We are African American, we are Latinx, we are Asian, we are immigrants, we are undocumented immigrants. We had our first refugee from the Ukraine show up. He's bisexual, you know, and we are indigenous people, we are everybody. And that makes us even more complicated, I feel, when it comes to a disaster. And also, not everyone is open about who they are. So that makes it also complicated. With some populations, it's really easy to know where you belong, but we can often hide who we are. And so we've been working on how do we work on, you know, disaster preparedness. So one of my favorite sayings is that we have to queerify all materials so that our community who does not feel the dominant culture cares about them will get it that they matter, if that makes sense. So here is the live file that you know, everyone gets, so you can have your information, you know, this one on your refrigerator, and I have to put like a rainbow heart on it so that our people will pick it up and say, oh, this includes us, you know, and they can pull the sticker off if they want. But for me to distribute it, I have to queerify it a little bit, you know? And it's with everything. Like we work with the Community Health Partnership, and that is their resource book. And nobody picked it up until I added a queerified sheet that has, you know, LGBTQ plus welcoming resources, blah, 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 and the colors. So queerifying the resources is a big deal to get our community's attention that they matter when a disaster happens. Now, there are some people in our community that feel like they connect with their neighbors and they are doing all the right things about when a disaster happens, they connect with their neighbors. But a lot of neighbors are hostile toward us. So we're either not open about who we are, or we don't want them to know who we are, and therefore are isolated. So the Villa de Frank LGBTQ Community Center, and you can see the pictures there, we're actually 11,000 square feet. So what I am looking to do is informally prepare ourselves. We have a storage area where we can, you know, in case an earthquake happens when there's a lot of people in the building, right? It's a city-owned building, and I still don't have an answer that if it's earthquake proof. I'm hoping it is. You know, if it's a city-owned building, it's got to be. But I'm gonna, you know, I'm in the process of writing grants to have little tents and all the supplies that we need in case there's a disaster. And I've got, you know, people in the building and all of that. So that's part one. Part two is I did a role play with a first responder who is a white heterosexual male who's retired from the fire department, who is very enamored by what they do. And it's really adorable. And I really appreciate it. But he's kind of a bit rough, you know. And I'm sort of trying to tell him, I think you need to clarify, some of your material, and also how you talk, because he's sort of like, I'm a first responder. I'm going to save people one household at a time. And I said, that may not go down too well with a lot of minorities. And I'm not just talking about LGBTQs, because one of the things that, people like him do, if they think you've got a broken leg, they'll want to touch you. And touching in many immigrant cultures does not go down too well, does not go down too well among different religious cultures. It does not go down well with lesbians. And I tell you, if it's a lesbian couple, the partner will read him the riot act. And so his answer was very macho. He said, well, if you're not going to cooperate, we're going to go to the next household. And I said, wait. That's really not the response I would like you to have. So he and I spent 5 hours talking for real. And his brain just exploded. And mine did too. I said to him, I don't think our people understand what your job is. So maybe I need to prepare our community for what first responders do so that they don't freak out. Because let's face it, when there's a disaster, everyone's freaked out, including you, I'd said to him, but you hide it because you've got a job to, to do. So he agreed. And so I'm also trying to put together, what do first responders do? What do you expect? And I'm hoping I can get to first responders to also understand that a softer approach is often better. Swift and soft is possible, but it's like a cultural thing. White heterosexual males are used to being macho and that is a cultural thing. Just like being an immigrant is a cultural thing, a religious thing, being queer. It's a cultural thing that we all have to be aware of. And he had no idea that he had a cultural thing about him. And I said, yes, you do. And it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it doesn't work in certain circumstances with certain people. So let's, at both ends of the extreme, be mindful of that and work together on that. And so, the vulnerability of the queer community right now, so many of our people come to the center, even just to play games in the library to sort of get the stress out of their head about all the hate that's out there. And that is like a big thing that we provide. It's a safe place to be who you are. And I'm hoping that when there is a disaster, people will gravitate toward us and that we will be able to help and support and be educated about what happens in a disaster. Little things like if there's 100 people in the building, that they know not to get on their cell phone as soon as an earthquake happens, because that'll just shut down everything even worse. And so, just stuff like that. And stagger the communication that can go on. And so, we need several languages as well. We have many cultures and religious folks that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. And we're the only minority that also not only encompasses all minorities, but we're also the only minority that often, not always, often is thrown out of the family because not all of our family members have accepted us. So when you think, here's how I'm thinking about it. If your family kicked you out And my family is an immigrant family. I was born 5 months after they arrived in Australia. They are Yugoslavian. In 1950, they hated Russia because they decimated, Yugoslavia, and so did the Germans. They hated everyone. And so I was brought up that you have to be self-sufficient. I can still hear my father say, "We do not rely on anyone," because everyone hated us. We were racially discriminated. The government recruited them, but the people hated them and screamed at them about not speaking English and that the Yugoslavians go back to your country, and they were racially discriminated against because we have high cheekbones. So it's interesting. Melina, you're laughing. And so, we all have, and they promised me that they were the only ones that will ever love me because everyone else hates us. And then when they rejected me because I was non-binary, I wasn't a girl, I wasn't a boy, and then I came out gay, they went crazy. And so I felt betrayed by them saying they'll be the only ones to love me, because I was very young when I came out. I was 16, naive teenager, thinking that they would love me forever, but they didn't. And so I had to leave home because the hate was too hard for my heart. And so I ended up homeless on the street. But that was better than being hated at home by people who said they would love me forever. And so in a weird sort of way, we translate that to how the dominant culture, the government, is supposed to be like our parent taking care of things when there's a disaster, right? So we don't believe it. And I've talked to so many people that if you don't have the special colors and you don't say LGBTQ, then we don't feel like we are part of you wanting to take care of us. And so there's got to be very specific outreach, which I'm obviously willing to help with, and make the Billy DeFrank Center a place where people can be educated about it. That yes, the parent government does want to care about us, even though we are LGBTQ. And that's a really, really big deal. And I think a lot of immigrant people feel that way too, because, especially after the Second World War, there was this big recruitment of immigrants from Europe in America and in Australia. But the people were awful to us. And so my poor parents were confused. And because they didn't speak English too well, they didn't know how to communicate that confusion, the promise of a new life. Well, my mother was upper class and she had to work in a cigarette factory. That was very upsetting. And my father, who was a dental technician, had very delicate hands to make teeth for people, had to use a pick and shovel to help build the roads. So he got calluses and everything. So the propaganda and the reality were two different things. And so you can just imagine us as adults with all the mixed messages, whether we're immigrant or not, being kicked out of our families, or our families having a big upheaval about, us being queer. We don't trust anything anymore. And so we have to be reached out to very specifically. And I do a lot of the graphic design, so I can help anyone queerify their material. And I'm working on the PowerPoint for cadre and queerifying it. So there's a special PowerPoint presentation that targets us. And so, you know, it is possible. I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm willing to be that in-between person educating our community about what happens in a disaster, and, you know, and be ready for it and buck up, you know, and at the other end, you know, please reach out to us in very specific ways, you know, so that our people believe that you want to help us, you know, and it's one of those weird things. We've got to somehow end up in the middle. So I'm hoping the earthquake doesn't happen for a while, because this kind of education takes a long time, you know. Social change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen with one flyer. But I have to say, this mural, that giant mural is facing our parking lot. It is making a difference. It is huge. It's about 50 foot tall and about 100 feet wide. So it's, you know, a person will barely make it up to the word love. That's how big that mural is. And, you know, I tend to be kind of bold. And, you know, I've been so sick of the hate out there toward everyone. And Billy DeFrank, who we named our center after, you know, was an African-American drag queen in the 1970s, when it was so not the case for African-American men to show any feminine side of themselves. And the queer community was not embracing very many races, but he was somebody that loved everyone and won them over with his drag shows, and he raised money for all the different groups. And so, you know, he was quite something. And I want to be like him, not a drag queen, but, you know, love everyone. And so, you know, we embrace his spirit. And
So great.
Yeah, so there's your intersectionality.
So,
So that-
Gabrielle, I love your message, and I think I think you should give all of us some rainbow stickers to put on our things, because
Yes.
rainbows add color to anything. So
Yes.
just, you know, send them out or put a printable thing on the website.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize one of the things that, you know, that I think for all groups, but possibly, well, for all groups, is proactive welcoming, you know, not just having the, you know, the philosophy or the mission that we would help anybody or we don't discriminate or whatever. That's in our, you know, mission statement. But to put things out, like at the shelters, to put a sign out that says gender-free bathroom or something like that, you know, or immigrant protected zone by law or something like that, so that it's out front and people can make a decision, you know, make the choice to go in freely, not to go in and hope that they don't get rejected or harassed. You know, proactive welcoming, I think special, it's, you know, we're trying to outreach to every group, but possibly some need a special invitation because of past history. And this is great that you reminded us. So, and there's more LGBTQ resources going to be in the resource book and on the website. So next we want to hear from Sherry Burns, the Executive Director of the Silicon Valley Independent Living Center.
I'm going to give you a few statistics because my colleague Maria Dane with Parents Helping Parents was also going to be joining us, and I think she's running a little bit late still. So if necessary, I'll cover some of her material as well. But my area that I was given was basically access and functional needs. Thank you so much, Francie. But access and functional needs, as you've heard both from Melina and Gabrielle, is more than half of our community. We're not talking about just people with disabilities, even though that's what I'm going to be focusing on, but we're also talking about people who don't speak English as their first language, or they don't have adequate, English skills to understand instructions and information in that language. People who are newly immigrants here, who maybe not know the resources or the protocols that we have in place, unaccompanied children, formerly incarcerated individuals, folks that are unhoused. I mean, the list goes on and on. So we are really talking about more than half of our population as having one or more access and functional needs. But I'm going to focus on disability and give you a few little statistics first, why disability matters in disaster preparedness and response. Well, 26% of the United States population identifies as having at least one type of disability. So we're talking about, a quarter of our population. And as you get older, we typically develop a disabling condition or chronic health condition that qualifies as a disability. So over the age of 65, that jumps up to 36% of our population of having a disability. And then over the age of 80, it jumps to a whopping 71% of our population having a disability. So a few statistics there. Also in the United States, people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or sustain a critical injury during a disaster than people without disabilities. So this is a highly vulnerable population. And just give a little background for the purpose of the discussion this afternoon. Disability is defined as including those with physical and mobility disabilities, sensory disabilities such as deafness or hard of hearing or blindness, learning, mental health, neurodiverse, and intellectual or developmental disabilities. It also includes, as I mentioned previously, people with a chronic illness or are in recovery for substance use disorders, as well as those with a history of these types of conditions. So Silicon Valley Independent Living Center, we have a variety of over a dozen different kinds of support, resource, advocacy, and independent living skill services that we provide to members of our community who have one or more disabilities and also chronic health conditions. And that includes both youth and seniors with disabling conditions. And next slide, please. I'm going to focus on the service that we provide to members of our community that are part of the medical baseline program with utility company. One of the services that we do is we are the Disability Disaster Access and Resource Center, or DDARC, for not only Santa Clara County, but also Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey counties. And we work in partnership with PG&E to assist residents with access and functional needs who live in Tier 2 or Tier 3 zones in the event of a public safety power shutoff. So that means that those Tier 2 or Tier 3 zones are areas that are more prone to power outages or the PSPS events. Typically because they are in high wind areas, their utility lines are near trees or other things that might fall on the power lines and then cause a shutoff or blackout. Our blue sky services include during non-disaster times is assisting folks with creating a personal or family emergency plan, providing them with backup battery loans. If they have a device that can benefit from having a backup battery if the power goes off. For example, CPAP and BiPAP machines, folks that rely on power for charging their scooters or power wheelchairs, refrigeration for specialized food or medications that need to be refrigerated, those kinds of things. Now, if they have a disabling condition or disability that cannot benefit from a backup battery, we will provide hotel vouchers for those individuals and actually transport them as well if they need it provide backup emergency caregiver services, whatever the needs are, food, and take care of all of that during a PSPS event while the power is out in their home. And then also assist them with completing the utility medical baseline application if they qualify for those services as well, which a lot of people don't realize is not income-based, it's needs-based. So it has nothing to do with the family's income if they qualify for that medical baseline. Next slide, please. Other disability disaster access resource emergency services that we provide is, as I mentioned before, home disaster planning. We also can provide folks with a free NOAA solar crank radio, so they can plug in their laptop or their cell phone and to charge it. And also to listen to the radio stations when they're giving out information about that particular disaster situation. So it maintains that communication, which is so vital for everyone in understanding what's going on, what they need to be doing next, and reducing anxiety. We also will provide a free one-day disaster supply fanny pack that they can attach to their body or to their wheelchair or walker. And it also is a great ready-go kit for people who need to, on a moment's notice, evacuate. And then for those that need to refrigerate their medications, we provide a free micro fridge to them. And that also has a charge cord that you can plug into a vehicle for recharging or keeping, the power going on it, or they can take it with them to a hotel. And we also have a partnership with Silicon Valley Clean Energy and the Central Coast Clean Energy for referrals and additional battery distribution. Next slide, please. So during an event or escalation of a situation, just like we had this month in January, it's not blue skies, it's power out, flooding, major disaster that people are in the middle of, is that we can be activated by PG&E's Emergency Operations Center. And we were on January 1st activated, and we were just deactivated last weekend. So it ran for nearly 3 weeks. We get referrals from PG&E directly about residents who are at risk because their power has been impacted and they're part of the medical baseline program, or because they've called the PG&E customer service line and said, look, my power's been out for, more than a day, sometimes 2 or 3 days. And I rely on power for my health needs. So our staff, once we get that, and by the way, this is statewide. This is a statewide program. So we're covering, as I mentioned, 4 or 5 counties, but there are other independent living centers around the state that are covering other counties and other jurisdictions. And so PG&E will send that information out to those particular DDAR centers to let them know somebody in their catchment area has a need. So our staff will check the PG&E outage map. And they will check to see what the outage map is showing as far as the power being out at that moment, because it could be several minutes later or up to an hour before we receive the notification. We also will receive on that information to see an estimated time of restoration or date of restoration. And so that's very helpful. Then we contact the resident to assess the situation and their needs. By the way, we have a language capacity in real time in Spanish as well, which is essential for certainly the residents throughout the county, but certainly South County, San Benito County, and Santa Cruz and Salinas have high Latinx populations and Spanish-speaking populations. So we're able to accommodate that. And also if somebody needs other language interpretation, we will use our language line services for that. But we assess the situation with the person. We create a plan for the resident, with the resident, to include one or more of the following interventions, which include information referral and assistance about resources and other services that might be available to them. We will arrange for a hotel stay with them, nearest hotel that's not impacted. We take a look at important considerations of whether or not they need a accessible hotel room for their needs, or they need a hotel room that has communication systems for them because they are deaf or because they're blind. Those kinds of considerations are looked at. Emergency meal deliveries. We also will provide gift cards. Typically, we use a Visa gift card because it can be used for a variety of needs, typically food expenses. It could be gas or propane if they have a generator, or just because of travel, those kinds of things we will provide for them, and those are FedExed overnight. And then also setting up emergency caregiver services for them if that's needed. And then our follow-up with them is to do an assessment afterwards and find out if they are on medical baseline, if they need assistance with that, and also to see if they're not already part of our public safety power shutoff program, is that we will do an assessment with them to see if they should be on that list. And we do a lot of proactive messaging and communication with folks, again, during the blue sky times, but also during an event, we were sending out almost daily messaging to everybody who was on that list. And that's over 800 individuals that we have on that list, plus the new ones that PG&E has given us. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, you know, we were activated during the storm, and we saw and experienced many of the same kinds of things, similar experiences and challenges seen during the 2020 fires and throughout the pandemic, as far as obstacles or barriers. And additional, if you will, lessons learned of things that we need to still work on or fine tune, or if they're not in place, we really as a community and need to look at putting in place. So some of the things is that, you know, our DDAR program is still relatively unknown to the public. It's only been in existence for a couple of years. It started just basically as we were entering the pandemic, late 2019. And we've been activated many, many times. Many of the centers, my sister centers and colleagues that are up in Napa and Sonoma and, you know, up in that area, Lake County, have been activated many, many times because of the fires. And then obviously the flooding was both in Northern and in Southern California from the atmospheric river storms back to back. So that was impacted many people across the whole state of California. But we need to make sure that we're trying to get this word out, which is a great opportunity today for me to share this with everyone here. Also, many residents who live in high impact PSPS areas and disaster prone areas are not self-sufficient. We still need to get messaging out to people about how they can be a little bit more self-sufficient and taking care of their own specific needs and addressing their own needs. And one of the reasons that we provide those one-day emergency disaster fanny packs is to get people started, to help people not only developing their own family disaster plan and evacuation plan, but also to get them started with the items that they need of food and water and flashlights and first aid kit and the Mylar blankets and all those kinds of things, so they have something to get themselves started and are not feeling like they need to start from scratch. But many also have limited resources, and another reason why I think it's helpful to get kits out to folks, which is the next point. They don't have a ready-go bag for quick evacuations. And this was so essential. We saw with some of the people that we were serving and getting them into hotels, is that, as you can imagine, it was not a panacea solution of FedExing overnight gift cards to people to pay for replacing their food, because if the roads are not available for us to get through during the storm, well, FedEx and UPS is not going to be getting through them either. So quote unquote overnight ended up taking 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 days to get to the individuals who needed them. Hence the backup, being able to order meals that sometimes an Uber driver, somebody else could get to them because it was real close by as a neighboring restaurant that was still open, or a little neighborhood grocery store, that kind of thing. Or they had somebody who could pick up those meals and bring them to them. So having those ready go bags, including a few days of essential food to keep people going for a couple of days, is also helpful. For those able to leave their home, a hotel stay is a game changer for maintaining their health needs. And shelters don't meet their needs. They often just cannot meet the needs of people with various disabilities and disabling conditions any more than people falling into other AFN categories. Congregate sites are not adequate or appropriate for many people. So we needed to be able to have hotel stays for folks to set them up in a environment that was as similar to their own home as possible, and that they had the ability to bring their wheelchair or their scooter with them, their caregiver, all of those kinds of things. So even utilizing suites and family type of hotel rooms was essential. Accessible rooms are important everywhere. It's wonderful that I think more and more hotels and motels, I mean, they should be making their rooms accessible and having at least a certain percentage accessible. But this was so important for folks that were in very, very remote areas, that we were able, like Boulder Creek, like Felton, like, up in the Los Gatos Hills and lower parts of Santa Cruz, they were not near a Hilton. That might have a number of accessible rooms. They weren't near a Holiday Inn. We had to use very close by motels and lodges that were private facilities to send, have people transported to. So it was really, again, an essential game changer, having accessible rooms for those individuals who needed them. And also having micro refrigerators and microwaves in those rooms as well. And then some residents cannot or just will not leave their homes, even when in danger, due to fear, they have a pet, or lack of needed support. Maybe, they again are an individual who has low vision or is blind, and so they know their layout of their home, and obviously even in the dark. But a hotel room is going to be difficult for them to navigate without having somebody there with them. They have a pet or 2 pets or 3 pets. Really, really tough to find motels and hotels that will take more than 1 or 2 pets. So that also can impact a person being willing to leave their house, even though they've been out of power and not having any heat, or if it happened to be, in the summer, air conditioning or fan use for multiple days. And then the last, big takeaway for us too was the transportation. This is always an issue with every single event and disaster, especially accessible transport for evacuations. We just don't see it as well coordinated as it should be throughout our county and just throughout, our state and our region and community. I had a couple of stories that I was going to share with you, but I'm just going to share one due to time. Lori, who had multiple sclerosis and used as a wheelchair, and her son had no power for 3 days and needed to get to an accessible hotel near her home, but away from the threat of flooding and mudslides. An accessible family suite at a nearby lodge was arranged for them and a meal delivered to their hotel. A gift card was FedEx to them, but it took 4 days to get there due to the road closures and unsafe driving conditions, resulting in more meals being delivered or picked up by her son. 7 days later, they were finally able to leave the lodge and return home. And then a PG&E claim form was sent to them so that they could fill that out to recoup some of their food losses. The next slide just lists some of the resources, and I know that, you know, we have on our website, and we send out to folks as far as how to get in touch with us about the DDAR program. There's many ways. If you could go to the next slide, Francie. And also another link there for the PG&E outage map, which everybody can access so that you can find out if the power is out in your area or somebody else's area, you're checking on a loved one, that kind of thing, and an estimated restoration date and time for that. Is Maria here yet? Is she able to join us?
I
Hi,
see
Sherry.
her in the list.
Hi,
No?
Sherry, are you able to hear me?
There you are. Okay, so Maria, if you
Okay.
want to share a couple
I don't
of
have
the
any.
wonderful nuggets with regards to importance of children and adolescents with disabilities and awareness of that population.
Sherry, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm Maria Dane. I'm Executive Director for Parents Helping Parents. We support families raising children with disabilities. And it's always a pleasure to work with Sherry, and she often starts serving where our services sort of end. So anyway, would like to discuss a little bit more around children with disabilities during disasters. I was looking it up. It turns out that people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or sustain a critical injury during disaster than people without disabilities. So this is a really important hidden population. Currently 1 in 44 children in our county, in Santa Clara County, and this is pretty close to the national figure also, are being diagnosed with autism. So we have a huge wave of autism happening in our community, and 1 in 5 have attention challenges. So children experiencing disabilities is approximately at the rate of around 20% in our community. I'd really like to, call your awareness to some of the unique dynamics of children with special needs or adolescents with special needs. Really tragically, last year, we had a young man who was with his mom, and there was a house fire, and he and his mom both died in the house fire, and he had autism. And he was a big guy. And I had lunch the next day with 3 of her friends, and they were reflecting on if they had a house fire, whether they could evacuate with their adolescent children with autism. And these moms said that they wouldn't be able to get their young adults out of the house. Their young adults would refuse. And the tragic part is they themselves, as moms, wouldn't have left either. Like they wouldn't have left their child alone in a house, to face that. And so there's often a risk to a larger family when a child has a disability. And as a community, we're only kind of beginning to make inroads on helpful conversations between fire departments and police departments, public safety officers, and families with disabilities. There are those in the disability community who want to identify that they have a child in the house with a disability, and there are those who don't want public safety to be aware of that. So we really haven't made a lot of progress on customizing public safety solutions for families who have children with disabilities. So a couple of things I'd just like to bring to your attention. First is that in the home setting, if the child or young adult cannot be evacuated by their primary caregiver, that they would need further assistance. And that child may have a physical disability, or they may in fact have an intellectual disability and may need assistance. Secondly, institutional settings that have a high number of children with disabilities may not have sufficient staff for a proper evacuation. Those might include schools, group homes. Some children with special needs have needs that surpass what their families can support, and they're living in your communities in small group homes, or state disability services. And so like there are post-secondary education, so 18 to 22-year-olds with disabilities who may be in job training programs in your community. And when we look at disparities experienced by our families who have children with special needs, there is a group that that whether it's within the school district or it's within medical systems, has the greatest disparity of all. And it is not children with special needs, it's children with special needs who are also of color. So those who have the double disparity of being children of color and having a disability are most likely to fall through the cracks in any of our systems of care. So if I was looking at a needs assessment for community, I would make sure to look at where your communities of colors are and what families are within that community, as well as what institutions are serving children with disabilities within the community, because that's the group that are potentially at the highest risk of suffering during a disaster. Does anyone have any questions that I may be able to assist with?
I think, Maria, I think we're going to have the questions all at the end so that all the panelists can address them.
Okay.
And yeah, I think this is really one of the really important things that Sherry pointed out, and I think you mentioned it, is transportation for people. This is a major gap for everybody, all vulnerable populations that don't have their own Cadillacs or Uber accounts, and that for people that need a wheelchair or mobility unit, there's VTA, but they've got very few vehicles really. If you were going to try to evacuate an area, they don't have, and almost all of the institutions or organizations that have people like rest homes that would need this kind of evacuation, when they write their disaster plan, they all list VTA as the way they're going to evacuate. So like probably thousands of people are being expecting to be taken in the wheelchair lift 3 vans that VTA has or something. So this is something that we can all look at. It's an invisible gap in our service that's going to really show up if we have to evacuate an area with a lot of old people or, you know, people with disabilities.
Yeah, and I'd look towards schools. There's a law firm doing a canvassing to find out how many schools are lacking in a written evacuation plan that includes the children with disabilities. And so there's, you know, in preparation for a lawsuit on this space, but, you know, we should be thinking it through now about how we're evacuating the special classrooms.
Yeah, I was very shocked to learn, and I checked on this again recently, and it still seems to be the case that the rule in schools that I knew of in multi-floor schools, that the teachers were supposed to leave the children in wheelchairs, evacuate the rest of the students, and the children in wheelchairs were supposed to wait by themselves in the room until somebody came to rescue them, which would have to be a terrible situation for the teachers and the other students, and the student that's left there alone waiting, hoping somebody will come. I still find that difficult to believe, but the liability of it was explained to me. But that is the policy in a lot of schools, and it's another obstacle to safety and health that we might all look at changing or addressing. So this is great. You know, we're getting a little short of time, but Marcia, if you could put up the homeless slides. We were planning to have a representative of Home First here to talk directly about their experiences of homeless obstacles, many of which we're all, you know, more or less familiar with. But I just thought I would run through a few of them, and largely through the eyes of the Red Cross staff and volunteers that was just recently opened, the 2 shelters in San Jose. It was really a first for the Red Cross in many ways of, you know, we've always opened shelters for anybody that was affected by a disaster. And of course, unhoused people are just as affected as anybody else if they lose their tent or their sleeping bag. So they're always welcome in our shelters, but we have, to my knowledge, never had shelters that were completely composed of this population. And in San Jose, we had 2 shelters open for quite a while, over 3 weeks, that had about 250 people in them, varying people, and the Red Cross staff and volunteers are not trained in this kind of population, so we really didn't know a lot of the issues that they were going to meet, and we had some help from county and city organizations, path and home first and behavioral health. But basically, what I was told by everybody working with people there is that when trying to pull people out of a disaster, when they came from very little resources before, it's really hard to get a foothold in the recovery stage, because all of the hotlines in the county that are given to people as a referral for shelter or housing or other resources, they almost all have a recording that says, tell us what you want, leave your phone number, and we'll get back to you. So a lot of the people that were evacuated from the rivers and creeks that were brought to our shelters, they didn't have a cell phone. Either they didn't have one before, or they might have lost it in the flood. And so they were very frustrated that even when they talked to people at the shelter about resources, they were given a flyer or a number that they should call. It was kind of on them to make this connection, and they didn't have a callback number. If they have also no fixed address to receive mail, you can sometimes, get a form and fill it in, but nobody's going to give you an instant resource anymore. Very few, unless it's meals and things like that. So to get really longer, mid and long-term resources, you need some way that they can contact you back after they've vetted your application. And they didn't have emails, and they didn't have internet access. There was an internet at the library upstairs in the Seven Tree Center, and they said that our clients could go up there, but they needed to sign up get a library card, and they needed an address. So finally arrangements were made where they could go upstairs and use the library for 15 minutes with no ID. And that, I think, was helpful for those that did have email addresses and knew how to use the internet, which was not everybody. So just saying that's the basic first step of getting any kind of resources to recover from an incident, is people have to be able to get in touch with you. And that's not easy for the unhoused. The health issues that people were experiencing, if you just went out there and looked at the people, I was myself surprised at the age group. I mean, so many of them were senior citizens, and they had clear, obvious mobility issues, health problems, mental health issues. You just had to wonder, how were they living next to the creek before, and what was going to happen to them when they left. And I'm sorry, the city of San Jose is doing a valiant attempt in offering them transitional services. So and those that chose, we've closed the 2 shelters now, but those that closed have been moved to 3 transition sites, and everybody received a kind of a homeless starter kit with a tent and a sleeping bag and some other things. But those that chose to move into the transition program will receive ongoing casework and further help by the city of San Jose. But the health issues that are experienced by homeless people are, much more exacerbated by the way they've been living. They have had, a lot of times no control over their temperature of their surroundings, their diets, how frequently they eat, whether they get medication, whether they can take it. It's everything that would be difficult or complicated for us to do is just added to by the fact that they don't have an anchor. They have no stable place to kind of like regroup and get, make a plan and think things through like an average person. Not average, excuse me, but people that were previously housed and had some stability might be able to do after a disaster. And also they had very low expectations of people. They've been disappointed a lot. They don't trust a lot of people. This is not everybody, but after a while, they just get kind of like worn down. I mean, many of them that I talked to, they just had tried so hard, and they were just people that weren't homeless for all their lives. They lost their jobs during COVID, or their husband left them with no income, or, many people's just lives have taken a turn in the last few years, and they're learning how to live this way, but they have learned also to not expect a lot out of the system because it's disappointed them. Can we see the next slide? So these were the obstacles, by the way, that were identified for me by the casework manager at the Red Cross, and also the external relations people. Ann Heresy, I think, is on the call. She has a team of people that were helping in the shelters with seeking outside partners, working with Cadre to get dry clothing and things that people needed right away. But Sue did identify that once you do decide that you're going to get ID, you're going to replace your ID, or you're going to get a new driver's license, or apply for something, you need transportation. And all the transportation that is free, that was free, that our volunteers knew of, was to and from the shelters, or between shelters, or to medical appointments. But first, many of the transportation modes, even though they would have been free, arrangements had been made. When people actually showed up to take them with their 5 laundry bags of belongings, or their dog, or whatever, they were not allowed to get on the buses or in the taxis. So there was free transportation, but they couldn't use it. And they have other places they had to go. If you want to get a new ID, you had to go to the DMV. Ultimately, you could apply online, but you had to go there. You had to have $35. And if you didn't have $35, we were told that Sacred Heart could issue a waiver for that, but you had to go to Sacred Heart and have an interview for that. And, piecing together these things was much more complicated than it might be if you had a car, or, a center to live in. So, and physical disabilities made it really hard to access public transportation. Even if it was possible, sometimes I was told the lifts didn't work on the buses, or things, where they did not feel comfortable. They didn't feel safe going out by themselves to do these errands. And we had limited bus passes. We didn't know how to use the San Jose taxi agreement. We didn't know if we could. So they were kind of, there wasn't like free mobility on several levels, and that hindered the recovery of some of these people. So I just wanted to share those few things, that I'm sure that we've all experienced it, but to put all these things in a pile, and these are experiences that all vulnerable people, low income, would have on a daily basis, maybe. So as we're trying to deal with climate change, which is like more and more not going to be separate disaster incidents with a beginning and an end, it's going to be more or less one big ongoing rolling difficulty for the most vulnerable people that just gets worse and worse, that we should start thinking about the way that we do things, and really trying to identify these situations ahead of time and close the gaps, because things are just going to get more difficult if we don't do that. And we're going to, more and more people are going to be left behind in the recovery from our new normal. So this is a time that we've left for people to ask questions, or share input, and let us know how you would like to address these things through Cadre, what you would like Cadre to do next. Anybody?
Francie, hi, this is Anita. I had, there were questions when we signed up, registered. Do you have that list? We can go over those
No,
questions.
I don't.
Oh,
I can grab that. Hold
Okay.
on a second. And I do thank Kat for asking about the other utilities in Santa Clara County, and we should have known that answer. But it turns out that the city of Palo Alto doesn't have any medical baseline type program. So they would have to all register with SVILC, and then I'm waiting for city of Santa Clara to get back to me. So there are 2 gaps that we need to fill right away and make sure that public education is getting out there.
Yeah, the questions were for areas that were not covered by PG&E. Did they have access
Right.
to resources?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Sherry, just a little bit additional information, even though I also added a little bit more in the chat box, is that the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, which is our membership organization based in Sacramento, They were the ones that put together the contract with PG&E to serve all of the areas that were covered by PG&E. And they're in the process of working with Southern California Edison as well. And I think San Diego, their power utility company. So those are the two bigger ones besides PG&E, and hopefully those will be online within the next year with a similar type of program. But the small cities that run their own, like you mentioned, Palo Alto and Santa Clara, is that they would have to develop a similar, type of program and fund it. And certainly, for first place to start would be to set up something with regards to medical baseline allowances. If they don't already have that, that would be a great start. But then also taking a look at a similar type of support program for people who are prone to PSPS events and disasters.
We had another question earlier in the chat about the confidentiality of information that was given to FEMA or the Red Cross or the first responders. And I could partially answer that. Possibly somebody else would like to add to it. But I mean, we go to a great extent to keep confidentiality in the Red Cross of all the information that's given to us. And there's, when people are interviewed for the Red Cross, there is a place that they could tell you if they want to have their information shared with the government or with other nonprofit service providers. And if that box isn't checked, then they are not supposed to go on the list of that would go to FEMA or anybody else. The reason to share your information, if you wanted to, was because more organizations working with your information might bring more resources for recovery. But if you did not want anybody else to know and you just wanted to be in the shelter, then that information would be kept private. And also FEMA has pretty tight rules about sharing information with immigration enforcement. But we have to say it's a very no information is purposely shared, but the connections between all the different databases can be somewhat porous. And so I would never say that it's absolutely impossible that anybody else outside could get information, because I don't know, but I know that the system is set up so that privacy is protected. And I think that basically, and it's important for people to consider, what kind of help is available and how bad they need it, because even undocumented immigrants can get partial government assistance if they have a citizen or an eligible immigrant child or adult in the family. They can get partial, like a ratio of assistance for the household. So we don't want to say that immigrants shouldn't even apply for anything, because they won't, they're all ineligible. But all these things have to be considered. And that's why I hope that all the service providers will at least get basic understanding of how these work and get help from the many free or low cost immigrant service providers in the county. And there's a list on the website immigrantinfo.org and also on the County Office of Immigrant Relations website of free help, legal help for immigrants.
Francie, it looks like Christopher Engel has his hand up.
Yes, hello. I'm so sorry if if my question, I've actually got two, were already covered or answered. My kids came home and it got a little hectic for a second. A previous slide was talking about the transportation issues that were related to transporting a population experiencing homelessness. I was just curious, did a solution emerge? Did you contract that out, or did you identify a transportation resource that was willing to service that community?
There was a couple of organizations. I think Home First was one of them, and they had vans that were going around and picking up people that needed to go. And I think, some of the people made it into the taxis and the buses. It was everybody, but I know that it wasn't. There was issues with that. I think it depended on who the taxi driver was or the bus driver or whatever, and how much stuff they had. But I just wanted to point out to people that just because we say there's free transportation, it doesn't mean that it works for everybody. There was issues with the mobility devices. and just people's, people's fear. I mean, many people haven't ever taken the public transportation. They don't know where it goes. They don't know where to wait for it. When we offer a resource, we have to just really look into how would that work? How would they access it? And does it work for everybody? And do we need to look at expanding it? Because usually expanding things costs money. And that's one of the last thoughts I want to, I think to leave with you is that a lot of these issues could be addressed. We were aware of them. We know there's more, but it costs money. It means adding to a system that, we've typically expected volunteers to take care of, or nonprofits to do for free. And I think as we move into more difficult times, it's not going to be just homeless that need help getting into a shelter in the warming and cooling centers. It's going to be seniors that don't have good heat or ventilation or air conditioning. It's going to be children with disabilities. It's going to be people that, need either equipment or special electricity or lower bills or special shelters, but people will need protection from our environment on an increasing basis. And these things are going to cost money if we don't start setting up the infrastructure. So I think if we, that's what makes Cadre so important, is the collaboration and sharing the things that we see that need to be addressed, and hopefully working together to get the structural changes that we'll need.
Thank you for that. I have a part two if it's not hogging up screen time. I don't know if anybody else has raised their hand.
I think really quick, because Marcia's going to have to do the wrap up in a minute, but what is it?
Sure. So how many of your services, I intuitively see where the DDAR would go up through the, whatever your county or operational areas, emergency management, establishment is. How many of the other services that were advertised today work regularly with your county operational area for, just for management of your services when needed?
It differs for every incident, but I would say most of us have worked at some level, either through each other, partnering with other service providers, or directly with the local government. But I think Cadre has served as the channel and the connection for a lot of the organizations to participate. Some of the bigger ones have always had their own relationship, like Catholic Charities and the homeless organizations. But we're trying to expand because the government doesn't always understand all the resources that are in the community and what it would take to access those resources on a regular basis, not a one-time volunteer basis, but to actually incorporate them into the plans so that their expertise or their language skills or whatever is part of the plan, and not just something that you ask for later when you notice it's not happening right. We're trying to be a little more proactive. Does that answer?
I'll just share that our county has regular operational area coordination calls. They involve the county departments and the cities. So as far as having nonprofits directly in that conversation, that's through Cadre, and Cadre is on those calls as well. And so we're the ones that are trying to make that happen. And even with the current disaster, we haven't been advised of where the people have been displaced. And we're now trying to make phone calls because it's not an automatic at the government level. They think the flood went away and we're all done, except to repair roads. And there are people that are missing out on services because we don't know they're there. And for whatever reason that they didn't understand. So there's always something to work on after every disaster. We have a ton of resources. Anita, I was looking at what people had asked, and it's primarily, are there resources out there? And we have a bunch. They will be loaded onto the website today. This is a vulnerability map. There's an interactive map tied to it that we're going to give you the link on this amazing list of resources that Francie brought together. But you can look and see where the lowest populations are. And many of our nonprofits already know this, but for those that are trying to learn a little bit more about where the potential problems might happen or where additional needs would be identified, this is a really good resource. And we're just about at time. So when we go off this Zoom, you should get a pop-up survey. It's like 3 questions. It asks about the value of the meeting, if you're interested in further discussions, and an area for comments. So if you think of other people that we should be including in the conversations, or other things that you'd like us to do more research on, make sure that you do that. And our next webinar is on February 16th. It's on writing emergency operations plans. But I think before that, we may, if you're interested, write in the comments that do we want to do kind of an after action hot wash for the storms? If there are things that you think should go better, or that it caused you to ask more questions, and then we will have something to work with to go forward on that as well. Anything else? All right, then I'll stop sharing. Thank you all. That was a great group of people. Thank you to all the presenters. It's just, we're so lucky to have people willing to get on these calls, and these are the people that we want to be talking to, the subject matter experts. And so it's just incredible to be able to do another one of these calls, and it's recorded, so if people missed it, you can point them to the recording.
One other thing, if any of you have clients that were affected by the flood, that had significant damage that wasn't insured to their homes, they should be they should be eligible for some assistance. And because Santa Clara County was so small, there may not be an assistance center, but they could call the number 1-800 Red Cross and at least report that they had damage, and make sure they get on the damage assessment report, and then they may be eligible for some resources. And if we get included in the federal declaration, they would be eligible for more resources. So, but the first thing is to get yourself registered as a disaster affected person.
And someone's asking where to see the recording. It's on cadresv.org/preparedness, and there's a whole section on pre-recorded trainings, and you'll see it there. It'll say new. Any last words? All right, thanks everyone.